This person was a car salesman, a trained security specialist, had anti-terrorist training, worked, and was lauded in the Air Force. How could anyone have known that Richard McNair would turn into a thief, murderer, and prison escape artist? While being appreciated for his skills and undercover operations, Richard was stealing from businesses just for the thrill of stealing, and one night, things went a bit far as a robbery turned to murder. Who did he kill? How was he arrested? How did he manage to escape from some of the most secure prisons in the world? And is he still on the run today? Fasten your seatbelt and join us as we uncover everything there is to know about Richard McNair. Let's begin. Richard McNair was born on December 19, 1958, in southwest Oklahoma to James and Willie McNair, and was the oldest of their 4 sons. They moved around quite frequently and eventually settled down in Stevens County, Duncan. His father, at the time, ended up working as a detective and a sheriff's deputy. Richard and all of his brothers were brought up to be both respectful and hardworking. In fact, after leaving school, he worked a number of different jobs ranging from construction to working as a radio announcer and DJ, due to which he developed the crucial skill of adaptability. Apart from these jobs, he also started selling cars and was very good at this, given that he had a natural charm and charisma. Later, at the age of 19, he moved to Edmond and enrolled at the Central State University to study criminal justice, only to quit after 6 months and go back to selling cars during 1980. Richard, at the age of 21, got married to Dorothy, his childhood sweetheart, who was 19 years old. Dorothy wanted to have children with Richard, but he was against it to such an extent that he got a vasectomy. His marriage to Dorothy only lasted for about 1.5 years, during which the seeds of a criminal path for Richard had begun to take root, as he had developed a keen interest in firearms and would often carry one around with him. Richard's first encounter with the law came when he was arrested for stealing a car and setting fire to it. A few years later, in 1982, Richard tried to discontinue on the path to crime and join the Air Force, trained as a security specialist in the military police, and even received anti-terrorist training. All of these skills would later prove to be handy for him later in life when he pursued crime again. Once Richard was trained, he was posted to Minot, North Dakota, where he initially took a partying approach to life. But later, he found that the alcohol he was consuming damaged his health and was causing stomach problems, due to which he stopped consuming it in 1983. The profound fact about his career is that he was often lauded for all this undercover work and scored highly in the reviews. But all of this wasn't meant to last long, and the culprit for this was none other than Richard himself. In 1987, he got into a fight while he was at a party, during which his left hand got injured. From this point onward, his military career started to fall apart, as he was later found with stolen goods. Although he was found not guilty, he later admitted to having committed the theft. This incident tainted his record for years, and he was demoted from being a highly ranked security specialist to an infantry clerk. After this, he began to rob multiple businesses on a regular basis, and although he didn't steal a huge amount of money, the impact of these robberies was immense. The interesting thing about these robberies is that Richard did not execute them for money, but for the sheer thrill of the act, and often just stored the stuff he stole. While Richard did all of this for the thrill, things were set to change on 17 November 1987, the day when he broke into an office at the Farmer Union Elevator Company. While attempting to open a safe in the office, he had to take a bathroom break as he was suffering from diarrhea. When he walked back to the safe, he noticed a semi-truck pulling up outside the office. In the truck were 2 individuals, Jerry Thies, aged 47, and Dick Kisman, aged 31. Both of them were oblivious to what was about to happen next. By the time Richard approached the door, Dick had already made his way up the stairs and knew that something wasn't right. The clue that set him off was the fact that the security gate, which should have been shut, was open, and placed alongside it was a small duffel bag that belonged to Richard. Among other items, they had a low-velocity .38 Smith & Wesson Special in it. Richard was armed when Dick opened the door and turned on the lights. However, he failed to notice him until he fired a shot aimed at his head. The bullet missed but scraped Dick under the ear as it smashed the glass door next to him. Due to the impact of the shot, Dick fell right to the floor and lay there in agonizing pain and terror as Richard approached him. He went up to Jerry, stood over his body, and fired 4 shots. Some of them had missed Dick's body, but the ones that didn't led to blood gushing out of his body. Dick lay there pretending to be dead, and Richard mistakenly thought he was the driver of the truck. Then he turned off the lights and left with the hope that Jerry had heard the shots and drove off, but that wasn't the case. When Richard left the station, Jerry called 911 to report the incident. However, during that time, something completely different had happened. As Dick talked to 911, he heard 4 shots being fired outside the station. To his surprise, Richard had shot Jerry 4 times through his truck window over a distance of 15 feet. Jerry didn't share the same fortune as Dick and lost the battle for life. The ironic thing is that Richard later returned home to his girlfriend that night, a nurse who was on duty when Dick was brought into the hospital. The police were quick in initiating efforts to find the shooter and knew that it would be the same person who was responsible for the multiple counts of breaking and entering that had taken place over the past year. Despite 3 months of investigation, the police had not come close to catching Richard. Earlier on, Richard had rented a storage unit under the Lee Richards to keep the goods he stole, but little did he know that this storage unit is what would later go on to become a breakthrough for the police when he tried to retrieve payments for the rent owed. When the police seized the unit, they opened it and discovered that it was stuffed with stolen carpets and other items that belonged to the airbase. Connecting the dots from this point onward wasn't a challenge. However, prior to this incident, the police had known Richard not as a criminal but professional known for his undercover work. February 16, 1988, marks the date when Richard was first arrested. To put the cuff on Richard, the police baited him in by asking him to come down to the station as he was needed for an undercover operation. As he answered a few questions, it became abundantly clear that he had something to hide and had invoked his right to legal representation. After being searched, Richard was found to be in possession of a fireman that was tucked away in his jacket. At this point, he was arrested, handcuffed to a chair, and left alone. This would turn out to be a crucial mistake because Richard, after a while, was able to use his lip balm as grease and slide one of his hands out of the cuffs. After that, he made a run for it, but was keen on spotting useful items as he headed towards the exit. Along the way, he snatched a coat from one of the racks and, to his surprise, found a Lincoln car key in the pocket. His luck didn't run out just yet. When he entered the parking lot to look for the car, the key matched the very first one he tried on. He started the car and made a run for it. The old automobile eventually came to a standstill after it had been driven down a block from the police station. Now, Richard was on foot once again, but unlike other criminals, he was well aware of his whereabouts. He knew of an apartment building nearby that had an empty room. And at that time, this room was what would be a safe haven for him. He broke in and had planned to lay low for a while, but was spotted and surrounded by the police sooner rather than later. Still determined to make an escape, he climbed out of a window on the 3rd floor and aimed to grab onto a tree. However, this plan would go in vain as he ended up falling to the ground and was quickly apprehended by the police. Although he was injured from the fall, he was still lucky to have survived it. After being released from the hospital, he was moved to the Ward County Jail. Law enforcement personnel would soon find out that it was only his first escape. As he was locked up, 2 cinder blocks were found to be partially chiseled out from the cell. Richard was charged with the murder of Jerry Thies, the attempted murder of Dick Kisman, and multiple burglaries. He pleaded guilty to the incident and received a lower sentence of around 25 to 35 years in prison. On July 22, 1988, Richard was transported from Minot to the North Dakota State Penitentiary. Upon arriving at the facility, He was immediately put in segregation, as it was estimated that he would try to escape and kill once again. While at the prison, he appeared to have settled in quite quickly and was a model prisoner. At the facility, Richard was one of those who were well respected by other inmates and the officers too. He gave lectures to school kids and was even a part of a crime prevention scheme. But that's not where the good behavior ends. He also wrote for the Prison Inside Times newspaper and by no means was a problematic inmate. Richard would often get visits from his family members and girlfriend, but their relationship eventually came to a predictable end. To an unaware observer, it seemed that Richard was finally on the path to making up for all of their criminal activities. However, inside his head, a different reality had been taking place. As he saw other inmates get out early on parole, the realization that this would not be a possibility for him for several more years to come began to sink in. As a result of reality, he became more and more resentful and eventually realized that the only way to prison and to be free was to execute yet another escape. He began planning his second escape from the grip of the law with another inmate, Randall Heisch, also known as Kicker. Randall was a computer expert and had volunteered to work overtime at Rough Riders Industry. At the workshop, both Randall and Richard, alongside other prisoners, manufactured a wide variety of items that included road signs, furniture, dumpsters, and more. Both of them knew that there was a huge exhaust pipe that ran throughout the facility and led outside of it, which made it the perfect getaway route. As a part of their master plan, Kicker would keep watch as Richard made his way through the vent to cut and dismantle security hardware. The duo soon realized that the cutter they were using wasn't strong enough and eventually found a plasma cutter that would do the trick. Richard was able to use the plasma cutter to make a path for escaping, and Monday morning was the time and date for when the escape would take place. However, before executing the plan, Richard made the crucial mistake of bringing someone else in on it. Word of their escape began to spread sooner rather than later, and they were caught before they could execute their motives. As a punishment, both Richard and Kicker were put in segregation and even had time added to their sentences. However, these consequences were not significant enough to deter his intentions of escaping. After spending time in segregation, he started working his old job again, where he was writing for the newspaper. As a part of his job, he would often take pictures of a new education facility that was under construction. It was within those pictures that a new plan to escape from the prison began to formulate. By observing the construction, he was able to see that there would be a huge drop between the ceiling and the roof. This space was to be utilized for air conditioning units. However, Richard figured that if he could get into that space and find a vent, it would lead him outside the building. Similar to the previous attempt, Kicker was in on this one too. This time, both of them were careful not to involve anyone else as they didn't want to repeat the same mistake they had made before. Despite all of their precautions, history repeated itself, and on the night of the escape, they let another inmate, Rick Holland, in on the plan since he was a former military professional who'd be useful once they had crossed the perimeter fence. It's worth mentioning here that the new education block had a TV and a VCR that the prisoner could use to watch movies. On October 9th, 1992, Richard chose a movie he knew no prisoner would want to watch so that everything would be clear for the trio to make an escape. All three of them closed the vents and settled down pretending to watch the movie, a biblical sage of the Ten Commandments. After a while, all of them entered the crawling space in the ceiling through a vent. Kicker worked on a paddock that allowed him clear access to the roof, while Richard and Holland found an easier alternative route that would lead them outside. Even after taking separate routes, all three men made it into the prison grounds. This location was known as a kill zone among the inmates, as anyone caught in it without authorization would be shot at the site. As the trio approached the fence, they were approached by a female police officer who was investigating what had happened, however, was unarmed. By the time she alerted other personnel, Richard, Holland, and Kicker had managed to make their way over the fence. Once they had made their way over the fence, the trio split up as it was each man for himself after this point. Holland, making an escape beyond the fence on foot, was the first to be captured as he had hurt his ankle and couldn't outrun the cops. The next to be caught again was Kicker. He had stolen a truck but couldn't get far away as he was recognized by someone passing by, leading to the cops closing in on him too. As for Richard, he'd managed to outrun the cops yet again by stealing a car and driving toward South Dakota. After this point, he kept moving from one place to another and had even grown out his hair and dyed it blonde to avoid being recognized. While on the run, he continued to work odd jobs like racehorse walker. During that time, he managed to visit his hometown, Duquesne, as well. On July 5, 1993, Richard was arrested for breaking into a car dealership and was sent back to the North Dakota prison. However, he was later transferred to the Minnesota Correctional Facility, a prison that no one could possibly escape from. Richard had realized this from day one, and instead of opting to initiate escape plans, he became a part of various sit-ins, causing him to return to North Dakota. However, this time around, he was transferred to Florence, a maximum security prison from which escape was not a likely option. Richard soon realized that as well. During his time in Florence, worked on repairing mailbags that had belonged to the U.S. Mail Service. Richard once again stood out among all the others since he was not known for drugs and affiliations with any other criminal gangs in the region. His physical appearance also did not match that of a person who would like to be held in maximum security prison, as he had no piercing tattoos and was in top shape. Despite this, he'd managed to build quite a reputation and was known for being an escape artist. Even in Florence, a place with immense security, Richard was planning his escape yet again. This time, the event would take place in April 2006 at 7:20 a.m. At this time, Richard arrived for work like it was an ordinary day. He got searched, put on his gear, and performed all the usual tasks. On the security camera, he could be seen making his way to the corner of the factory, and in that moment he realized that the day he had been waiting for was finally here. This was the day when a pallet of mailbags, yet to be repaired, was due to be sent out of the prison. Weeks before the day of the escape, he built a pallet large enough for him to fit in using supplies he had stocked up on. Richard had constructed a pod using metal poles and zip ties that he had taken from the mailbags. He had stocked up on various items that included food, clothing, personal items, and a map. It's worth mentioning here that the pallets were shrink-wrapped before they were taken back to the warehouse, but Richard had factored this into his plans as well. He used Hurlkin powder to make his way through the plastic bags and settle in. The pallet Richard was in was loaded on a transport vehicle at 9 a.m. The plan may seem simple at first, but it was one that ultimately threatened his life. Shrink-wrapped mailbags leave very little room for air and movement, and combined with temperature-induced sweat, make breathing near impossible. Being the escape artist that he was, Richard factored this into his plans as well. He had a snorkel out of rigid cardboard, which gave him a limited air supply, allowing him to breathe through a tube. Without this mechanism, he would have suffocated to death in the prison's warehouse. The interesting thing here is that all trucks supposedly have to be checked, and pallets that look unusual have to be put into quarantine for 24 hours. Richard knew, probably from experience, that the truck would not be searched and his plan would go smoothly, but there were minor hiccups along the way. As the truck stopped at the gate, one of the officers noticed something odd with his pallet and mentioned that it should be quarantined for 24 hours as the rules dictated. However, luck would favor Richard on this day, as the officials came to an agreement, the end result of which was to let the truck go. Once the truck reached its destination, all the pallets, including the one Richard was in, were forklifted and stocked in the warehouse. Once there, he had to wait for the staff to go on their lunch break before he got out. When that time came, he used a homemade blade to cut open the pod and break free. Although he was unaware of his whereabouts, the location was an open warehouse outside of prison. As he drew his first breath, he had become the first prisoner in U.S. history to escape from a UPS Pollock and the first one in 13 years to have broken out of a federal state penitentiary. But he hadn't succeeded 100% just yet, as the old catch-and-run attic was about to begin yet again. Hours after escaping from prison, Richard was stopped in Louisiana by a police officer named Carl Broadland.
What's your name?
Robert Jones.
Robert Jones?
Why, I'm not supposed to be on the tracks?
No, that's not the problem right now. What's your address?
I don't have an address. I'm at the hotel. We're working on houses and stuff like that, the roofing.
The officer began to do his due diligence without actually being aware of who he was dealing with. Upon initial interrogation, Richard told the police officer that he lived down the road and was staying at a place called the Titus Inn. Being an escape artist, thief, and murderer, Richard maintained composure as he was being interrogated by the police. He told the officer that his name was Robert Jones and that he was originally from Dallas, Texas. The officer, talking to the operator, asked for various physical signs that were, at the time, being used to verify Richard. He looked for tattoos, verified the height, and decided that he had the wrong guy and Richard go. A significant plus for Richard was that the image of him provided to the police was low quality and 6 months old. Another factor was that the prison had informed the police that they weren't completely sure if Richard had escaped. Borderland later claimed that the physical description given to him did not match the man he'd stopped on the street, and that's why he let him go. After his escape, Richard successfully crossed the American-Canadian border and entered British Columbia. He also had another run-in with the police when he was stopped in BC for a stolen car that he was driving. Police officers again asked Richard a few questions to which he responded calmly. However, the police officials decided to impound the vehicle they had but had failed to identify the fact they were talking to none other than the prison escape mastermind, Richard. Later on, he traveled back to the United States in a stolen Subaru and then entered Canada yet again. Only this time he had made his way up to Vancouver. In 2007, he traveled to eastern parts of Canada and was staying in Fredericton, New Brunswick, before he was comforted by the police. Being featured on America's Most Wanted, it becomes incredibly difficult for him to evade law enforcement personnel and go undetected. Despite all of this, he still wanted to support himself. To do that, he stole cash and vehicles from dealerships for going from one to the other until the supplies he had ran out. On October 24, 2007, an off-duty officer noticed a white van suspected that it was stolen. He reported the plate number and alerted other officials in the region. The van was stopped, and Richard was interrogated by the police and taken into custody. After the arrest, Richard was transferred to the Atlantic Institution, a Canadian maximum security prison. As he waited to be extradited back to the U.S., he did not resist being arrested. He's currently incarcerated at ADX Florence, another high-security prison in Colorado. ADX Florence is known for having the reputation of the Alcatraz of the rookies. The prison houses some of the most dangerous criminals in the United States. Speaking about the prison, Richard has said that he is incarcerated in the most secure section of the most secure prison in the world. Although his escapes had made him a famous name in both the United States and Canada, he will now spend the rest of his life in ADX Florence in a 12x9 concert cell. If you like this video, join us for more exhilarating stories. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.